We're going to ask him about the biggest challenges of being a trailblazer, the advice they give to young people, where their individual sports are going. I got to be a little selfish here. Bob, I find one of the most fascinating athletes as a young person growing up who loved tennis was Bjorn Borg. And you signed, I mean, you represented Borg, and you were, I think, 26, 27. And, like, was he as mysterious as he came across?
He you know, that quiet, mysterious kind of guy was Bjorn. But he was a phenomenal guy. And I was managing Vitas Gerulaitis at age 28 or 9. And Vitas and Bjorn were very close. And Bjorn actually went to McCormick and said, I want Kane to manage me. And McCormick said, well, you know, he's too young. You need a global executive with experience. And Borg said, no, I want him. So I liked Borg a lot. And I traveled the world with Bjorn, which was some very interesting stories that I probably can't tell here. But he was an amazing guy because he was so fit. The stories about his heartbeat and all that stuff were right. He was so dedicated and so focused. And as another guy taught me, you know, I thought I was an okay tennis player, but then I hung out with Bjorn Borg and Vitas Gerulaitis. I realized why I was an okay college tennis player. These guys killed themselves for a long period of time. Careers were short, different reasons, but Bjorn's career was short because he was so intense and so dedicated for such a long, you know, when he was doing it. So he really had a career from 26 to 27, from 17 to 26.
26.
But it was a very special time. You know, I had one good story about Bjorn?
Sure.
So in 1980, Israel was building Israeli Tennis Center, and they decided tennis would be a very important thing for their country, and they could build some champions. So Borg and Gerulaitis, I negotiated a deal for them to come and play an exhibition at the Israeli Tennis Center. And we got there, and Borg was such a big star back then. I mean, he was a little bit like Tiger Woods, and the long blonde hair, everybody knew him. So we went, we met the president of the country. They took us on a guided tour. We were in the Dead Sea. We went to the Jerusalem, then we went to the Dead Sea. And at the Dead Sea, the Borg and Gerulaitis, the guide was telling us how buoyant it is, how much salt content there is. They talked me into taking my pants off and floating in the Dead Sea. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and all of a sudden, a bunch of Israeli soldiers walk up, and they all start taking pictures with him. And 2 weeks later, death threats because Borg's an Israeli Jewish supporter, and I'm floating in the Dead Sea. McCormick calls me into his office when I get back. He said, didn't you go on that trip with Borg? I said, yeah. He said, isn't your job to kind of protect him? Yeah. And he said, well, where the hell were you when they were taking pictures with Israeli soldiers, which are now all over the world? And I said, I was floating in the Dead Sea. There you go. I thought I was going to be fired, but fortunately, Borg and Gerulaitis stood up for me, and I carried on. So.
Great stuff. I can imagine those were some fun days. Biggest challenge throughout your career, one area where you persevered, where you had to push through. Ron, start with you.
Well, with the X Games, the real thing there was, the challenge was selling the idea that, you know, because what we were really doing, what we were looking to do was very similar, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, is when rock and roll came out in the early 60s, and parents said, these aren't real musicians, this isn't real music, this is a fad, this is never gonna last. And ESPN, there's a lot of folks who really prided themselves on being sports traditionalists. You know, one executive said that ESPN was the New York Times and these sports were the National Enquirer. You know, and so trying to convince enough people that there was something here with pursuing these sports was probably the biggest challenge. And then, you know, the rewards still come to this day. Last week, the first U.S. Olympic skateboarding team was announced. They're going to compete in 2020 in Japan. Yeah, okay. And, you know, who would have ever thought that that's something that would...
Never would have happened without what you did. Earl,
well,
it's true, but Earl, what challenge that you had to really bust through on?
Well, I think it started earlier today, talk about in our practice back in the early 80s, I mean, it was all about seats. It was bizarre. And everybody just kind of made up sorry, they just made up the capacity. Because I had whatever I had before. They really weren't market driven. They just said whatever another team had, that's how many seats I want. So it wasn't really focused on it. So I think the biggest challenge for us that we've not struggled, but we've had to kind of overcome is the transition from the seated experience to just the experience, where it's not so much I'm selling a seat, I'm selling whatever else I have. And that's been 10 years in the making. And the comparisons of, what X team has versus Y team, those days are over. And so I think that's been, because they had to believe their own market, they actually had to get data and make good decisions, and they had to, in some ways, take a gamble. They had to risk their investment on whatever the market's going to bear out. And so I would say that's probably the biggest and the longest hurdle we've had to deal with.
Kevin?
I feel my entire career has really been based on being uncomfortably comfortable. And, so many people in life, and I think it's just human instincts, look for comfort. You like the temperature right way. I mean, things have to be perfect, and I think we've been trained like that. But when I go back to my accident, I had to, basically a year out of my life, I had to learn how to be uncomfortably comfortable. And so even in a body cast, to be comfortable. And I think organizationally, so mine is more not any one specific. Yes, the stadium is this, that, and the other, but it's just creating an environment where people can operate and be uncomfortably comfortable.
Do you like to make people uncomfortable?
Yes, because I think, I'm a big believer. One of the reasons why tennis, you need a coach. You take Tom Brady, probably the greatest quarterback, you need a coach. I just think, generally speaking, the human body and mind and soul and spirit is designed to be comfortable. And so I think you really get a chance to understand and see what people are made of when you put them in very uncomfortable situations. Not cruel, there's a difference. A lot of leaders may think, cruelty is the way to go, not that. But I think you get the most out of yourselves and you feel better about it when you are really uncomfortable, when you work through it. Because you think about what are the stories that you talk about in your family life, in your career. There are those stories where something went haywire. You don't talk about the family dinner where you had a good decision. Dinner and the food was good and there was no tough conversation. If you ask your kids or family members, what do they remember? They remember those vacations when something went haywire. And so I just think in your career, when you can put people in a position where they have great haywire stories to tell, they buy in more and they feel better. And when you accomplish it and get it done, you have a bond that will last forever.
That's very fascinating. Buffy and Bob, other instances of challenges you had to fight through?
Well,
Buffy.
Well, it always seemed to be when I was trying to find a job.
Yeah.
That seemed to be my biggest challenges. So when I got out of college, I subscribed to Billie Jean King's Women's Sports Foundation magazine, and it had listed all the women's athletic directors. And I wrote to all of the women athletic directors, and I asked for a job, and I got 100 letters of rejection, and I alphabetized them to make sure that whether I had them all. When I applied to a job with Wilson Sporting Goods, I was turned down on my second interview, and I thought, why did I got this guy that came in who wasn't really supposed to be interviewing me. So I called up somebody else and I said, I think I need another chance to do that interview. I did another interview and I got 2 job offers. Wow. Bob, you were nice, offered me a job, and so Bob offers me this job, and Bud Stanner, and they say, we want to sign Tracy Austin. Do you remember this? We're in London. We want to sign Tracy Austin. And I said, well, if you want to sign Tracy Austin, then you shouldn't hire me. Do you remember this? And I said, because I'm not going to be able to get her. Could you imagine? I was 23 years old when I said this to you. Yeah. And then when I was applying for a job with Korn Ferry, I called Dick Ferry's office and I said, I'd like to start your sports practice. And because they had run the Los Angeles Olympics and hired Peter Ueroth. And so I called him, and then I got a ding letter from the Cleveland office. And I called up Dick Ferry's office again, and I said, I'm Buffy Philippale. I got this ding letter from the Cleveland office, and I said, if Mr. Ferry doesn't want to hire me, I'd like to hear it from Mr. Ferry. Well, of course, I got the job.
Oh,
wow.
So,
Very good. Wow.
For you.
Well, first female agent in IMG history, and
done.
one of the first
Well done.
female agents in sports. And her husband took her off to Italy. We couldn't keep her, but she did okay without us, by the way. And I spent 2 years trying to sign Tracy Austin, by the way, after Buffy told us we couldn't sign Tracy Austin. But one challenges, but I'd say disappointment's a pretty good thing, a pretty good lesson learned early. I went to Tracy Austin's house in Rolling Hills for about 2 or 3 years trying to sign her. Big deal for me to sign this young superstar. And they turned me down and turned IMG down. And in the next 12 months, I signed Chris Everett, Martina Navratilova, and they were #1 in the world for the next 10 years. So one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was not signing Tracy, as nice as she is. And then when I started the skating business, the first meeting I had was I went to see the 1983 world champion named Rosalind Sumners and her parents. And at the end of the recruiting meeting, her stepdad said, "Have you ever not signed anybody? That's the greatest pitch." 2 weeks later, she signed with Peggy Fleming's agent. But in the next 3 months, I signed Scott Hamilton, and we built a skating business and Stars on Ice. And our first hire in Stars on Ice was Rosalind Sumners, who's now my wife. So,
All worked out pretty well.
anyways, so losses
You couldn't
sometimes.
sign her, but you ended up marrying her.
I worked on it hard. It took me a long time on that one,
That pitch worked.
but I mean, so take those losses and turn them into wins.